The night was cold, and the air was thick with smoke. James, a young soldier, crouched behind a fallen tree, gripping his rifle tightly. His unit had been ambushed, and he was the only survivor. The forest was silent except for the distant sounds of gunfire and the occasional shout of enemy soldiers searching for him. He knew he had to move, but every step could mean death. James took a deep breath and crawled through the thick undergrowth. His uniform was torn, and his body ached from the battle. His mind raced. He had lost his map, his food, and his radio. He was alone, deep in enemy territory. The only way to survive was to reach the river he had seen on an old map before the attack. If he could cross it, he might find Allied forces on the other side. As he moved carefully, he heard footsteps crunching on leaves. He pressed himself flat against the ground, barely breathing. 2 enemy soldiers walked past, speaking in a language he didn't understand. One of them stopped suddenly. James's heart pounded as the soldier shined a flashlight around. The light passed over him, then moved away. The soldier muttered something and walked on. James stayed frozen until he could no longer hear their voices. Slowly, he got up and moved forward. His boots were wet from the damp forest floor, and his stomach growled from hunger. He had not eaten in 2 days. The pain in his body was nothing compared to the fear of being caught. He needed to stay strong. After an hour of walking, he reached the edge of the forest. Beyond it, there was a small village. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the streets were empty. James knew it was dangerous to go there, but he needed food and maybe a weapon. He crept through the shadows, staying close to the walls of the buildings. He spotted a small bakery with its door slightly open. Inside, an old man was stacking bread on a shelf. James hesitated. He could not risk making noise, but he needed food. He slowly stepped inside. The old man turned around, eyes widening in shock. James quickly raised a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. The old man studied him, then nodded. He reached for a loaf of bread and handed it to James. His hands were rough, his eyes kind. James whispered, "Thank you." The old man pointed toward the back door, signaling him to leave quickly. James nodded and slipped out, his heart still racing. As he turned into an alley, he suddenly heard shouts behind him. The enemy had spotted him. James ran as fast as his tired legs could carry him. Bullets whizzed past, hitting the walls and ground. He darted between buildings, searching for a way out. He saw a barn at the edge of the village and sprinted towards it. He threw himself inside and slammed the door shut. He could hear boots approaching. Looking around, he saw a ladder leading to the hayloft. He climbed up quickly and buried himself under the hay, barely able to breathe. The door burst open, and enemy soldiers entered. They searched the barn, knocking over barrels and boxes. James stayed completely still. A soldier poked his rifle into the hay, missing James by inches. After a long moment, the soldiers cursed and left. James stayed hidden for another hour just to be sure. Then he climbed down carefully. He was alive, but he could not stay there. He had to reach the river. Leaving the barn, he stuck to the shadows, moving quickly through the fields. His muscles ached and his wounds burned, but he could not stop. The river was still miles away. As dawn approached, he reached a road. He was about to cross when he heard the rumbling of a truck. He ducked behind a tree as an enemy vehicle rolled past, carrying soldiers. Then he saw something strange. One of the men inside was wearing a uniform similar to his. It was an Allied soldier, captured. James's mind raced. He could not attack the truck alone, but he could not leave the soldier behind either. He needed a plan. He followed the truck from a distance until it stopped near a camp. The enemy soldiers pulled the prisoner out and led him inside. James crept closer, hiding behind crates. He saw a guard standing near the entrance, smoking a cigarette. James picked up a small rock and threw it into the bushes. The guard turned his head. That was all James needed. He rushed forward and struck the guard from behind, knocking him out silently. Then, he grabbed the guard's knife and slipped inside. The prisoner was tied to a chair, his face bruised. He looked up in surprise as James cut the ropes. "Can you walk?" James whispered. The soldier nodded weakly. James helped him up and handed him the guard's knife. They had to escape fast. They slipped through the camp, avoiding patrols. But just as they reached the outer fence, a spotlight turned on. They dove in. The icy current pulled them, but they fought to stay above water. Gunshots rang out, but the enemy did not follow them into the deep. The river carried them far away, past the reach of the camp. When they finally crawled onto the shore, exhausted but alive, they saw something that made their hearts swell with hope. A flag in the distance. The Allied forces were near. They had made it. James looked at the soldier beside him and smiled. "We're going home," he said. For the first time in days, he felt safe.